Well, here we are. It's Thursday, August 25th, 2022, and I'm Larissa. And today I'm going to continue reading Haroun in the Sea of Stories, a novel by Mr. Salman Rushdie. Chapter 2, The Mail Coach. The two shouting men shoved Rashid and Haroun into the back seat of a beaten-up car with torn, scarlet seats. And even though the car's cheap radio was playing movie music at top volume, the shouting men went on shouting about the unreliability of storytellers all the way to the rusting iron gates of the bus depot. Here, Haroun and Rashid were dumped out of the car without ceremony or farewell. Expenses of the journey? Rashid hopefully inquired, but the shouting men shouted, "More cash demands! Cheek! Cheek of the chappie!" and drove away at high speed, forcing dogs and cows and women with baskets of fruit on their heads to dive out of the way. Loud music and rude words continued to pour out of the car as it zigzagged away into the distance. Rashid didn't even bother to shake his fist. Haroun followed him towards the ticket office across a dusty courtyard with walls covered in strange warnings. "If you try to rush or zoom, you are sure to meet your doom," was one of them. And, "All the dangerous overtakers end up safe at undertakers." And another. And also, "Look out. Slow down. Don't be funny. Life is precious. Cars cost money." "There should be one about not shouting at the passengers in the back seat," Haroun muttered. Rashid went to buy a ticket. There was a wrestling match at the ticket window instead of a queue because everyone wanted to be first, and as most people were carrying chickens or children or other bulky items, the result was a free-for-all out of which feathers and toys and dislodged hats kept flying. And from time to time, some dizzy fellow with ripped clothes would burst out of the melee, triumphantly waving a little scrap of paper, his ticket. Rashid, taking a deep breath, dived into the scrum. Meanwhile, in the courtyard of the buses, small dust clouds were rushing back and forth like little desert whirlwinds. Haroun realized that these clouds were full of human beings. There were simply too many passengers at the bus depot to fit into the available buses, and anyhow, nobody knew which bus was leaving first, which made it possible for the drivers to play a mischievous game. One driver would start his engine, adjust his mirrors, and behave as if he were about to leave. At once, a bunch of passengers would gather up their suitcases and bedrolls and parrots and transistor radios and rush towards him. Then he'd switch off his engine with an innocent smile, while on the far side of the courtyard a different bus would start up, and the passengers would start running all over again. "It's not fair," Haroun said aloud. "Correct," a booming voice behind him answered. But you'll admit it's too much fun to watch." The owner of this voice turned out to be an enormous fellow with a great quiff of hair standing straight up on his head like a parrot's crest. His face, too, was extremely hairy, and the thought popped into Haroun's mind that all this hair was, well, somehow feather-like. Ridiculous idea, he told himself. What on earth made me think of a thing like that? It's just plain nonsense, as anyone can say. Just then, two separate dust clouds of scurrying passengers collided in an explosion of umbrellas and milk churns and rope sandals, and Haroun, without meaning to, began to laugh. "You're a tip-top type," boomed the fellow with the feathery hair. "You see the funny side. An accident is truly a sad and cruel thing, but crash! Wham! Spatoosh! How it makes one giggle and hoot." Here the giant stood and bowed. "At your service," he said. "My name is Butt, driver of the number 1 Super Express mail coach in the Valley of K." Haroun thought he should bow too. "And my, as you say, good name is Haroun." Then he had an idea and added, "If you mean what you say about being at my service, then in fact there is something you can do." "It was a figure of speech," Mr. Butt replied. But I will stand by it." "A figure of speech is a shifty thing. It can be twisted or it can be straight." "But Butt's a straight man, not a twister. What's your wish, my young mister?" Rashid had often told Haroun about the beauty of the road from the town of G to the valley of K, a road that climbed like a serpent through the pass of H towards the tunnel of I, which was also known as J. There was snow by the roadside, and there were fabulous multicolored birds gliding in the gorges, and when the road emerged from the tunnel, Rashid had said, then the traveler saw before him the most spectacular view on earth, a vista of the valley of K, with its golden fields and silver mountains, and with the dull lake at its heart, a view spread out like a magic carpet, waiting for someone to come and take a ride. No man can be sad who looks upon that sight, Rashid had said, but a blind man's blindness must feel twice as wretched then. So what Haroun asked Mr. Butt for was this: front row seats in the mail coach all the way to the dull lake, and a guarantee that the mail coach would pass through the tunnel of I, also known as J, before sunset, because otherwise the whole point would be lost. But, Mr. Butt protested, the hour is already late. Then, seeing Haroun's face begin to fall, he grinned broadly and clapped his hands. But, so what? He shouted. The beautiful view to cheer up the sad dad before sunset. No problem. So when Rashid staggered out of the ticket office, he found Haroun waiting on the steps of the mail coach with the best seats reserved inside and the motor running. The other passengers, who were out of breath from their running and who were covered in dust, which their sweat was turning to mud, stared at Haroun with a mixture of jealousy and awe. Rashid was impressed too. As I may have mentioned, young Haroun Khalifa, more to you than meets the blinking eye. Yahoo! Yelled Mr. Butt, who was as excitable as any mail service employee. Varoom! He added, and jammed the accelerator pedal right down against the floor. The mail coach rocketed through the gates of the bus depot, narrowly missing a wall on which Haroun read this: If from speed you get your thrill, take precaution, make your will. Faster and faster went the mail coach. The passengers started to hoot and howl with excitement and fear. Through village after village Mr. Butt drove at top speed. Haroun observed that in each village a man carrying a large mail bag would be waiting by the bus stop in the village square, and that this man would look at first confused, then furious as the mail coach roared by him without even slowing down. Haroun could also see that at the rear of the mail coach there was a special area separated from the passengers by a wire mesh partition that was piled high with mail bags, just like those held by the angry, fish-shaking men in the village squares. But Mr. Butt had apparently forgotten to deliver or collect the mail. Don't we need to stop for the letters? Haroun finally leant forward to inquire. At the same moment, Rashid, the storyteller, cried out, Do we need to go so blinkin' fast? Mr. Butt managed to make the mail coach go even faster. Need to stop, he bellowed over his shoulder. Need to go so quickly? Well, my sirs, I'll tell you this, needs a slippery snake. That's what it is. The boy here says that you, sir, need a view before sunset, and maybe it's so, and maybe no. And some might say the boy here needs a mother, and maybe it's so, and maybe no. And it's been said of me that Butt needs speed, but it may be that my heart truly needs a different sort of thrill. Oh, needs a funny fish. It makes people untruthful. They all suffer from it, but they will not always admit it. Hurrah, he added, pointing. The snow line. Icy patches ahead. Crumbling road surface. Hairpin bends. Danger of avalanches. Full speed ahead. He had simply decided not to stop for the mail in order to keep his promise to Haroun. No problem. He shouted gaily. Everybody gets other people's correspondence anyhow in this country of so many, too many places, and so few, too few names. The mail coach rushed up into the mountains of M, swinging around terrifying curves with a great squealing of tires. The luggage, which was all tied down on the roof rack, began to shift about in a worrying way. The passengers, who all looked alike, now that their perspiration had finished turning the dust that covered them into mud, began to complain. My hold all! Yelled a mud woman. Crazy buffalo, Looney Tune! Desist from your speeding, or my possessions will be thrown to kingdom come. If it is we ourselves who will be thrown, madam, a mudman answered sharply. So less noise about your personal items, please. He was interrupted angrily by a second mudman. Have a care. It is my good wife you are insulting. Then a second mudwoman joined in. So what? For so long she has been shouting in my husband's good ear, so why should not he lodge complaint? See her, the dirty skinny bones. Is she a woman or a muddy stick? See here this bend, what a tight one, Mr. Butt sang out. Here, 2 weeks ago, occurred a major disaster. Bus plunged into gully, all persons killed, 67 lives minimum. God, too sad. If you desire, I can stop for taking a photographs. Yes, stop, the passengers begged, anything to make him slow down. But Mr. Butt went even faster instead. Too late, he yodeled gaily. All right, it is far behind. Requests must be more promptly made if I am to comply. I did it again, Haroun was thinking. If we crash now, if we're smashed to bits or fried like potato chips in a burning wreck, it'll be all my fault this time too. Now they were high in the mountains of M, and Haroun felt sure that the mail coach was speeding up as they got higher. They were so high that there were clouds in the gorges below them, and the mountainsides were covered in thick, dirty snow, and the passengers were shivering with cold. The only sound to be heard in the mail coach was the chattering of teeth. Everyone had fallen into a scared and frozen silence, while Mr. Butt was concentrating so hard on his high-speed driving that he had even stopped yelling Yahoo and pointing out the sites of particularly gruesome accidents. Haroun had the feeling that they were floating on a sea of silence, that a wave of silence was lifting them up towards the mountaintops. His mouth was dry, and his tongue felt stiff and caked. Rashid couldn't make a sound either, not even arc. Any moment now, Haroun was thinking, and he knew that something very similar must be in the mind of each passenger. I'm going to be wiped out like a word on a blackboard, one swish of the duster, and I'll be gone for good. Then he saw the cloud. The mail coach was streaking along the side of a narrow ravine. Up ahead, the road swung so sharply to the right that it seemed they must plunge over the edge. Roadside notices warned of the extra danger in words so severe that they no longer rhymed. Drive like hell and you will get there, was one, and also be dead slow or be dead. Just then, a thick cloud shot through with impossible shifting colors. A cloud from a dream or a nightmare hopped up from a gorge below them and plopped itself down on the road. They hit it just as they went around the bend, and in the sudden darkness, Haroun heard Butt slamming on the brakes as hard as he could. Noise returned. Screams, the skidding of tires. This is it, Haroun thought. And then they were out of the cloud, in a place with smooth walls curving up around them and rows of yellow lights set in the ceiling above. Tunnel, Mr. Butt announced. At the far end, Valley of K, hours to sunset. 1. Time and tunnel, some minutes only. One view coming up. Like I said, no problem. They came out of the tunnel of I, and Mr. Butt stopped the mail coach so that everyone could enjoy the sight of the sun setting over the Valley of K with its fields of gold, which really grew saffron, and its silver mountains, which were really covered in glistening pure white snow, and its dull lake, which didn't look dull at all. Rashid Khalifa hugged Haroun and said, "Thanks for fixing this up, son, but I admit that for some time I thought we were all fixed good and proper. I mean done for. Finito. Katam shud." Katam shud, Haroun frowned. That was that story you used to tell. Rashid spoke of it as if he were remembering an old dream. Katam shud, he said slowly, is the arch enemy of all stories, even of language itself. He is the prince of silence and the foe of speech. And because everything ends, because dreams end, stories end, life ends, at the finish of everything, we use his name. It's finished. We tell one another, it's over. Katam shud, the end. This place is already doing you good, Haroun noted. No more arc? Your crazy stories are starting to come back. On the way down into the valley, Mr. Butt drove slowly with an extreme caution. But there is no need for speed now that my service has been performed, he explained to the quivering mudmen and mudwomen, who then all glared furiously at Haroun and Rashid. As the light failed, they passed a sign that had originally read, "Welcome to K," but somebody had daubed it with crude irregular letters, so now it said, "Welcome to Kashmir." What's Kashmar? Haroun wanted to know. It's the work of some miscreant, shrugged Mr. Butt. Not every person in the valley is happy, as you may find. It's a word from the ancient tongue of Frange, which is no longer spoken in these parts, Rashid explained. In those long-gone days, the valley, which is now simply K, had other names. One, if I remember correctly, was Kashmir. Another was Kashmar. Do those names mean anything? Haroun asked. All names mean something, Rashid replied. Let me think. Yes, it was Kashmir. It can be translated as the place that hides a sea. Wait till he's done barking. But Kashmar is a rude name. Come on, urged Haroun. You can't stop there. In the old tongue, Rashid admitted, it was the word for nightmare. It was... Are you quite finished? Are you quite finished? It was dark when the mail coach arrived at the bus depot in K. Haroun thanked Mr. Butt and said goodbye. But I will be here to escort you home, he replied. Best seats will be kept, no question. Come when you're ready. I will be steady. Then we'll go vroom. No problem. Haroun had been afraid. Are you done? Are you done? No? I think you're done. Stop. I'll be right back. I want to see what he's barking at. Nothing. Nothing. Where were we? It was dark when the mail coach arrived at the bus depot in K. Haroun thanked Mr. Butt and said goodbye. But I will be here to escort you home, he replied. Best seats will be kept, no question. Come when you're ready. I will be steady. Then we'll go vroom, no problem. Haroun had been afraid that more shouting men would be waiting for Rashid here, but K was a remote place, and news of the storyteller's disastrous performance in the town of G had not traveled as fast as Mr. Butt's mail coach. So they were greeted by the boss himself, the top man in the ruling party of the valley, the candidate in the forthcoming elections, on whose behalf Rashid had agreed to appear. This boss was a fellow so shiny-faced and smooth, dressed in white bush shirt and trousers so scratchy clean and neat that the scruffy little mustache straggling over his upper lip seemed to have been borrowed from someone else. It was far too tawdry for a gent as slick as this. The slick gent greeted Rashid with a movie star smile whose insincerity made Haroun feel ill. Esteemed Mr. Rashid, he said, an honor for us, a legend comes to town. If Rashid were to flop in the valley of K the way he had in the town of G, Haroun thought this gent would soon change his tune, but Rashid looked pleased by the flattery, and anything that cheered him up was worth putting up with for the present. The name, the slick gent said, inclining his head slightly and clicking his heels together, is Bhutto. Almost the same as the mail coach driver, Haroun exclaimed. And the slick gent with the ratty mustache threw up his hands in horror. Not at all the same as any bus driver, he shrieked, suffering Moses. Do you know to whom you speak? Do I look like the bus driver type? Well, excuse me, Haroun began, but Mr. Bhutto was marching away, nose in air. Respected Mr. Rashid, to the lakeside, he commanded over his shoulder. Bearers will bring your bags. During the 5-minute walk to the shore of the dull lake, Haroun began to feel distinctly uneasy. Mr. Bhutto and his party, which now included Rashid and Haroun, were permanently surrounded by exactly 101 heavily armed soldiers, and such ordinary people as Haroun noticed on the street wore extremely hostile expressions. There's a bad feeling in this town, he told himself. If you live in a sad city, you know unhappiness when you run into it. You can smell it on the night air when the fumes of cars and trucks have faded away and the moon makes everything look clearer. Rashid had come to the valley because he remembered it as the most joyful of places, but it was plain that trouble had found its way up here now. How popular can this Buteau be if he needs all these soldiers to protect him, Haroun wondered. He tried to whisper to Rashid that perhaps the slick gent with the face fuzz wasn't the right fellow to support in the election campaign, but there were always too many soldiers within earshot, and then they reached the lake. Waiting for them was a boat in the shape of a swan. Nothing but the best for distinguished Mr. Rashid, crooned Smooty Mr. Buteau. Tonight, you stay in the finest houseboat on the lake as my guest. I trust it will not prove too humble for a grandee as exalted as you. He sounded polite, but he was really being insulting. Haroun understood. Why did Rashid put up with it? Haroun climbed into the swan boat, feeling irritated. Oarsmen in army uniform began to row. Haroun looked down onto the water of the dull lake. It seemed to be full of strange currents, crisscrossing in intricate patterns. Then the swan boat passed what looked like a carpet floating on the water's surface. Floating garden, Rashid told Haroun. You weave lotus roots together to make the carpet, and then you can grow vegetables right here on the lake. His voice had a melancholy ring again, so Haroun murmured, Don't be sad. Sad? Unhappy? Yelped Snooty Buteau. Surely eminent Mr. Rashid is not dissatisfied with the arrangements. Rashid, the storyteller, has always been incapable of inventing stories about himself. So he answered truthfully, Sir, not so. This is an affair of the heart. Why did you tell him that? Haroun thought fiercely, but Snooty Buteau was delighted by the revelation. Not to worry, unique Mr. Rashid, he cried tactlessly. She may have left you, but there are plenty more fish in the sea. Fish? Haroun thought in a rage. Did he say fish? Was his mother a pomfret? Must she now be compared to a glumfish or a shark? Really, Rashid should bop this Buteau right on his stuck-up nose. The storyteller trailed a hand listlessly in the water of the dull lake. Ah, but you must go a long, long way to find an angelfish, he sighed. As if in response to his words, the weather changed. A hot wind began to blow, and a mist rushed at them across the water. The next thing they knew, they could see nothing at all. Never mind the angelfish, Haroun thought. I can't even, just at the moment, find the tip of my own nose. Well, isn't this the interesting story, isn't it? There are so many layers of cultural reference in this book, and it is very, very easy to see why extremists would be so upset, right? He's poking fun at Islamic extremism. He's showing the absurdity. So often, you hear people say, oh, and even I have thought, they said from time to time, why don't you see more people from the Islamic world stand up and speak out against extremism? And it's because of how brutal. Look at what they've done to this man for writing a story. For writing a story. Why tell stories that aren't even true? Therein also lies a cultural reference. And this is something that is not just unique to Islamic world. Art historically has been banned in many cultures, including the Jewish culture, right? That's why the work of Chagall was so revolutionary. within Jewish culture, right? But looking at history of Romani culture, right? Because there are both Muslims and Christians in Romani culture. There is an historic taboo about anything that isn't documentary, right? And this comes out of, this taboo, rose out of discrimination, in that there are always accusations of, if you belong to this group of people, that you must be a liar, a cheater, and a thief, right? So there are taboos within the culture, and this is one of them. Writing or telling fiction, because it's seen as a form of lying, or interpreted as such, or could be interpreted as such. It's an example, and you see this in lots of different cultures, an example of an internal cultural taboo that exists directly because of external discrimination, right? Feel better soon, Mr. Rushdie. Feel better soon.